Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. It's 10 BBY, and life is kinda terrible. You were promised great adventure, heroics, and opportunity to carve out a legacy of your own as one of the Emperor's finest troopers. Attached to the 224th Imperial Armored Division, you were trained for mechanized warfare, a fluid and beautiful dance of man, machine, and overwhelming amounts of firepower. But now you're covered in mud. Your synthetic leather boots are soaked, and instead of riding along on an armored column to the next objective, you're defending a trench line. And all you can see in every direction is just mud. And to make matters worse, this planet you're on has no agricultural potential. And that means all the food you're having is shipped in from orbit, and that food is from many, many light years away. You haven't had real, actual food since you stepped foot onto the planet. Enter the reality of military logistics. Now, the military food supply chain is very different from the civilian food supply chain that we are all used to. While there are some federal subsidies in most countries and planets to ensure at least some staple foods are affordable and accessible, the majority of civilian food supply chains are built on consumer demand, and these food supply chains can be simple or very complex depending on the wealth, culture, and taste of those consumers. One of the great perks of living in a place like New York City is that you can literally eat anything you want in the world here. There are many different immigrant communities who all bring their food to this city, and locals who live here are far more open-minded about what they consume as a result. Combine that with massive amounts of wealth and you have a diner's paradise. But New York City has been a relatively stable place for the last century, and such stability is necessary for such a complex food supply chain to develop. A luxury that a military logistics chain can never really have. In the Empire's military food supply chain, the end consumer's wants are not really taken as seriously as what their needs are. And more importantly, the military, especially one that has expeditionary capabilities, is going to be mobile. It's going to travel to different parts of a planet, to different parts of the galaxy. That means less permanent and predictable food supply chains. And so most military organizations have a variety of different rations that are used in different situations. Now, at the most simple level of categorization, there are two types of rations. You have garrison rations and field rations. Garrison rations are basically food that can be obtained or sold within a more permanent outpost. This can vary vastly depending on how large a military base is and where it's located on the food supply chain and what is grown locally. And then you have field rations, which are designed for units or individuals far away from military infrastructure. Field rations mean instead of deploying a unit with a kitchen or mess unit, you're deploying the individual with their own food, which is usually preserved or packaged in a way that it can last for the duration of an operation. Now, before we continue though, a quick word from our sponsor for today's video, ownersaber.com. They are one of the premier lightsaber sellers on this side of the Hydian Way. And from July 3rd to July 31st, the entire store is going to be 30% off with free shipping. Plus now, ownersaber.com is offering the option for you guys to engrave the Wraith Bearer lightsaber hilt with any phrase or name that's up to 10 characters long. All you have to do is add the Wraith Bearer's special bundle into your cart and then type in the notes section what you want written on the saber hilt. Remember guys, for this to work, you have to select the Wraith Bearer in the special bundle option. If you just select the Wraith Bearer from the Padawan Saber category, you will not get the engraving done. I'll be linking everything in the description down below if you guys are interested in this offer. As usual, thank you for your patience. On to the rest of the video. One of the most famous innovations made by the United States during World War II was the K-ration. This was a field ration that consisted of 3 meals, breakfast, dinner, and supper. It contained a wide variety of non-perishable foods like hard biscuits, cheese, canned sausage, and other mystery meats, along with Wrigley chewing gum, Hershey bars, and a pack of Lucky Strikes if you were lucky, and maybe some Pall Malls if you were not. The K-rations were designed for emergency and field use and handed out to paratroopers, motorcycle couriers, and other individuals who might find themselves far from a proper field mess for days at a time. The K-ration definitely didn't win the war, but it was another example of America's economic and agricultural might during this time period. And I would argue that these K-rations significantly increased the operation time for the average infantry soldier before they had to come back and basically fill up with more food and supplies. So garrison meals put a lot of energy into the preparation of the food. That means cooks, field kitchens, and fresher ingredients. The creation of field rations put a lot more energy at the beginning of the food supply chain at the processing stage. Military field rations have always needed preservation, and in many ways, that need has driven the food preservation industry as a whole. Salt pork and hardtack were two popular preserved foods used during the American Civil War. As a kid, I actually remember talking to a Civil War reenactor who let me try some hardtack that was preserved from 1850. And basically, you couldn't consume it. It was impossible. You had to use massive amounts of saliva to break this stuff down. But then again, desperate times call for desperate situations, and a field ration that is spoiled is more or less useless. It can put a quick end to an otherwise successful military operation. Of course, not all field rations are as bland and disgusting as hardtack. For instance, did you know that M&Ms were invented around World War II? In an effort to prevent chocolate from melting, they put a candy shell around it. The Galactic Empire also had their own version of field rations, including the infamous Stormtrooper Ration, infamous because of what it did to one's bowels. Considered as non-transferable Imperial property, as in you weren't allowed to transfer it to any civilian unless you want to violate Code E973A. These small packs of nutrition were so important for the Empire's ability to wage special operations against its own people that these food packs became a strategic asset. And they were oftentimes found on the tool belt of a stormtrooper right next to their spare mags. These packs were made up of dehydrated veg meat and polystarch and become active and expanded once exposed to water. The meal itself didn't taste like bread or meat or whatever it was supposed to look like, but the point is it kept people alive and basically lasted forever. I mean, all those scabs on Jakku 30 years after the Galactic Civil War ended were still working for old food rations from that time period. Ration packs also had energy bars, protein cubes, and nutrient paste, the latter of which is rumored to be made up of recycled clone troopers. Some of these rations were also labeled as, like Joppa stew or Nuna jerky, but again, these were just vague descriptions of what they were going for. Didn't necessarily mean they actually made these rations taste anything like the real thing. It should be noted, in Rey's survival guide, she mentioned that the New Republic's rations were tastier than what the Empire was dishing out, but spoiled a little bit quicker. We actually see Luke Skywalker bring out several boxes of Rebel military rations during his trip to Dagobah, and it definitely looks more decent and varied than Imperial rations. Yoda even gets a sample of some of this stuff, and I guess having lived off of frogs and mushrooms for a few decades made him appreciate the variety that Luke was getting here. There are also emergency ration bars, which were used by clones and the Rebel Alliance. They were described as bland as well, but to those not familiar to them, like the Ewoks, they were considered to be quite tasty and nutritious. One of the reasons why the Rebel Alliance had tastier rations is because they had to build a logistics chain from the ground up, and they also had to serve a much smaller military force. The Rebel Alliance would create safe worlds all across the galaxy, like the one we see the Resistance fall back onto on Crate during the First Order War. Some of these safe worlds actually became agricultural centers that primarily focused on creating rations for the growing Rebel Alliance military. And stationed on these planets, you had wounded service members, you had the spouses of fighters, you had political prisoners, other non-combatants who weren't necessarily willing to fight, but they could help in other ways. Also, the fact that most Rebel forces were drawn from the Outer Rim meant that you had plenty of planets that were still suitable for massive agricultural production. The Empire, on the other hand, would see their food production capabilities decrease throughout the war, especially after the Mid-Rim offensive. As more and more worlds joined the rebellion, food supply chains became more strained. Units cut off from their logistics network would have to rely more and more on field rations to supplement their garrison rations. To make matters worse, the Empire had a stupid tendency to overfarm entire planets and leave their soil barren instead of practicing more sustainable field rotation techniques. After a decade of Imperial rule, once vibrant and rich agricultural worlds were turned into desolate wastelands, all in the name of building the glorious Imperial military. These would be assets and resources that the Empire would desperately need at the end of the war. Now, post-Endor, it became increasingly difficult for the Empire to resupply and equip their Imperial-class Star Destroyers. Many of the vessels were now running on skeleton crews with just a portion of their weapons emplacements turned on. The Empire would fall into a cycle of losing territory and then losing food production capabilities, which would lower morale, which would also cause more Imperial soldiers to desert, making it harder for them to defend whatever territory they still had left. And producing field rations wasn't all that simple. It required processing plants and massive amounts of raw materials, something that became harder and harder for the Empire to secure. In the months leading up to the final battle of the Galactic Civil War, Imperial troops stationed on Jakku desperately scavenged for whatever food and water they could find on the planet, reverting to a more old-school way of provisioning your military force with food by raiding, pillaging, and stealing from the locals. Now, ultimately shipping soldiers out with their own emergency food, instead of shipping a kitchen mess with your unit, was a huge breakthrough in military technology. It allowed more streamlined supply lines and more mobile troops and deployment of light infantry far away from the front. If you take a closer look at the Empire's military and their military doctrine, you'll begin to understand how big of a challenge they faced. Even at its height, the Imperial military never had enough resources to maintain a permanent presence in all of its territory. And so instead they had to depend on these mobile bases of operation. At the center of the Imperial military strategy was the Sector Fleet, which was comprised of several Imperial-class Star Destroyers. These 1.6-kilometer long vessels were battleships by design, but in reality served more as a forward operating base for a legion of stormtroopers. These ships served as not only a home, but also as a recreation center. There were hospitals, schools, and of course, multiple cafeterias and cantinas. There was usually enough food supplies on these ships to last the crew up to 2 years. Now, because an Imperial-class Star Destroyer was so large, there was actually room for livestock, for small gardens, hydroponics, that kind of stuff. But the reality was, most of the Empire's food was mass-produced and heavily processed, especially what was consumed by the Imperial Navy. You had a variety of different blobs and cubes and pastes that were all grayish in color and very nutritious but lacked taste. Now, there was fresh food available, especially for officers, but there was also a strict culture that shamed individuals who avoided consuming the nutrient blocks and nutrient drinks and ate real food instead. Enjoying real food was seen as a luxury and also a weakness. Such social restrictions are important, especially when you're confined inside of a small space vessel with limited resources. Also, being on an Imperial-class Star Destroyer meant that you were actively deployed, so lower food quality was tolerated because these weren't seen as permanent deployments. But on Coruscant in the Federal District, I'm sure the mess hall in the Imperial Military Headquarters building is going to be excellent and take full advantage of Coruscant's place as the galaxy's hub for trade. And so you had foodstuff from every corner of the galaxy flowing into Coruscant, and that is what made garrison rations on Coruscant excellent. And it makes sense. I mean, if you're Emperor Palpatine, you would want to reward those who are most loyal to you, and you could find those individuals on Coruscant. Certain military installations like the Death Star was also built with such luxuries in mind and actually featured multiple restaurants and cantina dining options. It was a way for the Emperor to thank his most elite and loyal officers and soldiers. But what happens if you start moving away from the core, away from all of the elites that are stationed there? Well, if you're stationed at a Outer Rim garrison, what you eat depends a lot on what's being produced locally in the region. These locally sourced foods are designed to supplement the garrison rations. On Lothal, for instance, the Meluran was heavily coveted by the Stormtrooper Legions, and the Empire would buy out local stocks in order to improve their own rations. And while you're at it, maybe your quartermaster can convince some local farmers to part with a bantha or two. One bantha could be split into hundreds, if not thousands, of delicious rations. So that's all the information I basically have on how the Imperial military fed its soldiers. This might not be the most interesting video, but again, we all know logistics are what wins wars, and an army marches on its stomach. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. My name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy.